The sky over Varus was a permanent shade of gunmetal gray, stained by the ash and smoke from 1,000 burning factories. The air tasted like rust and oil, a constant reminder that life here was hard and death came easy. But the Knights of Terra's wrath weren't here to breathe clean air. They were here to kill. Grandmaster Alaric Thorn stood at the head of the hall, his armor hulking and brutal, a blend of ancient steel and advanced polymers. The servos in his joints whined softly as he moved, the red visor of his helm scanning the rows of warriors before him. Behind him, the banners of Terra's wrath hung like specters, each one stained with the blood of 1,000 battles. Brothers, Thorn's voice boomed, the speakers in his helm amplifying it to a roar. Today we go to war. The knights, 100 strong, all in their armor, stood silent and still. Their swords, sleek and deadly, hung at their sides, powered by microreactors that hummed with barely contained violence. They had taken their oaths before on Earth, under the shadow of mountains older than memory, but Thorn made them say it again now, here, before they plunged into the maelstrom. "Repeat after me," Thorn said, his voice cutting through the cold air. "I am the sword of humanity." "I am the sword of humanity," the knights echoed, their voices a deep rumble. "I am the shield against the alien." "I am the shield against the alien." "I will fight until my blood runs cold and my body is broken." "I will fight until my blood runs cold and my body is broken." "I will die with honor, and I will take 100 of them with me." "I will die with honor, and I will take 100 of them with me." Thorn's gauntleted hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. For Terra. For humanity. For Terra. For humanity. The oath complete, Thorn turned on his heel and marched out of the hall, the knights falling in behind him. Outside, the wind howled like a dying animal, carrying with it the stench of burning fuel and charred flesh. The aliens had been here for weeks, slaughtering the colony's inhabitants, turning the planet into a butcher's yard. Now it was the knights' turn to bleed. They moved as one, a phalanx of metal and flesh, down the ramparts of their fortress and into the waiting dropships. The machines growled to life, their engines coughing out clouds of black smoke as they lifted off, carrying the knights toward the battlefield. Varus stretched out below them, a wasteland of ruined buildings and scorched earth. The aliens had done their work well. Where once there had been life, families, children, hopes and dreams, now there was only death. The drop ships touched down with a bone-jarring thud, and the ramps slammed open. Thorn was the first out, his sword already drawn, its blade hissing with energy. The ground beneath his boots was slick with blood, and the air was filled with the sounds of battle, screams, gunfire, the wet slap of flesh being torn apart. The aliens were waiting for them, grotesque things with too many limbs and mouths full of serrated teeth. They came at the knights in a tidal wave of claws and fangs, eager to add more human skulls to their collection. But the knights didn't flinch. Thorn led the charge, his sword a blur of motion. The first alien he met was split in half before it even had a chance to scream, its black blood spraying across his visor. The second lost its head in a single stroke, its body collapsing in a heap of twitching limbs. All around him, the knights waded into the enemy with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Swords cleaved through alien flesh, blood arched through the air in dark streams, and the ground became a slick mess of gore and viscera. The aliens fought back with savage fury, their claws rending armor, their teeth gnashing through flesh, but the knights held their ground, giving as good as they got. Thorn's breath rasped in his throat, his muscles burning with exertion, but he didn't stop. Every swing of his sword was another dead alien, another pile of meat on the killing floor. The ground beneath his feet was littered with bodies, both human and alien, but he kept moving forward, cutting a path through the chaos. He didn't know how long they fought. Time lost all meaning in the blood-soaked haze of battle. But eventually the tide began to turn. The aliens' numbers thinned, their attacks became less coordinated, and soon they were falling back, retreating into the shadows from which they had come. Thorn stood amidst the carnage, his armor dented and smeared with gore, his sword dripping with black blood. He looked at the bodies around him, his knights, his brothers, cut down by alien claws and left to rot in the dirt. But they had died with honor, just as they had sworn. For Terra, Thorn whispered, his voice ragged. For humanity. He raised his sword high, and the surviving knights, bloodied but unbroken, echoed his cry. The first battle was over, but the war was just beginning. Blackstone's citadel loomed like a nightmare on the horizon, a twisted mass of alien architecture that defied logic and reason. It was a fortress of jagged obsidian spires, pulsing with a sickly green light, as if the stone itself was alive. The air around it crackled with energy, and the ground shook with the rhythmic thrum of some colossal engine buried deep within. The Knights of Terra's Wrath had fought their way here through miles of hell. The plains leading up to the citadel were littered with the wreckage of war, burned-out husks of dropships, the smoldering remains of alien war machines, and the bodies of the dead, both human and alien, piled high in obscene mounds. The stench was unbearable, a mix of burnt flesh and rotting corpses, but the knights didn't flinch. They had smelled worse. Grandmaster Alaric Thorn stood at the head of the assault force, his armor battered and scorched, his sword humming with barely contained energy. Behind him, the surviving knights formed up, their numbers diminished but their resolve unbroken. They had lost brothers to the alien horde, but there was no time to mourn. Blackstone had to fall. The citadel is the key, Thorn growled through his helm speakers, his voice rough with exhaustion. We take it, we break their hold on Varus. We fail, and we die here. There was no need for speeches. The knights knew what was at stake. They had bled too much and lost too many to falter now. With a curt nod, Thorn led the charge. The ground under their boots was a blackened wasteland, cracked and scorched from the fighting. The air was thick with ash and the distant sound of alien screams, echoing from within the citadel's twisted walls. As they approached, the gates of Blackstone shuddered open, releasing a horde of alien defenders. They were monsters, each more grotesque than the last. Some crawled on all fours, their bodies covered in chitinous armor, claws snapping at the air. Others towered over the knights, their limbs bristling with organic blades, their eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. They screeched and howled, a cacophony of rage and hunger, and then they charged. Thorn met them head-on, his sword a blur of motion. The first alien, a hulking brute with serrated limbs, lunged at him, its jaws wide, saliva dripping from its fangs. Thorn sidestepped the attack and brought his sword down in a brutal arc, cleaving the creature's head from its shoulders. Black blood sprayed across his armor, sizzling as it hit the metal, but Thorn didn't pause. Another alien was already upon him, its claws raking across his chest plate, leaving deep gouges in the metal. He drove his sword through the creature's midsection, twisting the blade as it sank deep into alien flesh. The thing let out a shrill, gurgling scream as it collapsed, its insides spilling out in a steaming pile of viscera. Thorn yanked his sword free and pressed forward, cutting down anything that stood in his path. Around him, the knights fought with the same brutal efficiency. The air was filled with the sounds of steel clashing against bone, the wet crunch of flesh being torn apart, and the screams, human and alien alike. Blood, red and black, painted the ground, turning the earth into a slick, treacherous mess. The knights were outnumbered, but they fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Every alien they killed was another step closer to the citadel. The fight dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity of violence and death. The aliens seemed endless, pouring out of the citadel like a living flood, their numbers unrelenting. For every one the knights cut down, another took its place, howling for blood. But the knights were relentless. They pushed forward, step by bloody step, toward the citadel's gate. Thorn led the final charge. His sword was slick with alien blood, his armor dented and cracked, but his grip was steady. The gate of Blackstone loomed before him, a massive, impenetrable wall of alien metal. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him, the exhaustion creeping into his bones, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. With a roar, he drove his sword into the gate. The blade, powered by the microreactor in its hilt, cut through the alien metal with a blinding flash of light. The gate shuddered, groaned, and then collapsed inward with a deafening crash. The way was open, but the fight was far from over. Inside the citadel, the knights found themselves in a nightmare. The walls pulsed with a sickly green light, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed like living things. The floor was slick with alien ichor, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The aliens came at them from all sides, swarming out of the shadows, their claws and teeth flashing in the dim light. The knights fought with a grim determination, their swords carving through alien flesh with brutal efficiency. But the citadel was a death trap, designed to whittle them down, to break their spirits as much as their bodies. The aliens fought with a savage, animalistic fury, their attacks relentless, their bodies seemingly impervious to pain. Thorn could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him, his muscles burning with exhaustion, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had lost count of how many aliens he had killed, but it didn't matter. There were always more. Always another horror lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. He pushed forward, carving a path through the carnage, his mind focused on one thing, the heart of the citadel. He could feel it, a pulsing, malevolent presence drawing him in, promising an end to the nightmare. But getting there meant cutting through wave after wave of alien defenders. The knights fought on, their numbers dwindling with every step. The walls of the citadel seemed to close in around them, the air growing thicker, more oppressive. Every breath was a struggle, every movement a battle against exhaustion and despair. But they pressed on. They had to. Thorn reached the heart of the citadel, a massive chamber filled with a pulsing, green light. The source of the light was a monstrous creature, unlike anything they had faced before. It towered over them, its body a mass of writhing tentacles and eyes, its maw filled with row upon row of serrated teeth. It let out a low, rumbling growl, the sound vibrating through the floor, rattling their bones. The final battle was short and brutal. The knights, reduced to a handful of bloodied, battered warriors, threw themselves at the creature with a desperation born of hopelessness. Thorn led the charge, his sword flashing in the sickly light, cutting through tentacle and flesh. The creature lashed out, its tentacles whipping through the air, smashing armor, crushing bone. But the knights didn't falter. They fought with everything they had, their swords cutting deep, their blood soaking the floor. Thorn, his body screaming in agony, drove his sword into the creature's heart, a massive, pulsing organ at the center of its chest. The creature let out a deafening roar, its body convulsing, tentacles flailing wildly. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, it collapsed, its body slumping to the floor in a heap of steaming flesh. The knights, covered in blood and alien ichor, stood in the silence, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The siege was over. Blackstone had fallen. But as Thorn looked around at the blood-soaked chamber, at the bodies of his fallen brothers, he couldn't shake the feeling that the victory had come at too high a cost. "For Terra," he muttered, his voice hollow. "For humanity." But the words felt empty, lost in the echo of the citadel's dying heartbeat. The ruins of Varus' capital stretched out like the corpse of a giant, its broken bones jutting skyward against a blood-red horizon. The once proud city was now a wasteland of shattered buildings, twisted metal, and ash-covered streets. What remained of the population had fled underground, leaving the surface to the knights and the endless tide of alien invaders. Grandmaster Alaric Thorn stood atop a crumbling tower, his armor caked in dried blood, his sword resting heavily in his hand. Below him, the remnants of Terra's wrath prepared for their final stand. The knights moved with the lethargy of the exhausted, their bodies worn down by days of relentless combat. But there was no escape, no reprieve. The alien fleet hung in the sky like a harbinger of doom, blocking out the sun, its tendrils reaching down to the surface, disgorging wave after wave of enemy troops. The battle at Blackstone had been a bitter victory, but it had bought them little time. The alien forces had regrouped, reinforced by fresh troops from their invasion fleet. Now the knights were cornered, their backs against the wall, with nothing left to lose. Thorn knew they wouldn't survive this. But that didn't matter. What mattered was how many of the bastards they could take with them. He turned to the knights gathered around him. They were a grim sight, bloodied, battered, their armor scarred and pitted, their faces shadowed with exhaustion. But there was no fear in their eyes. Only the cold, hard determination of men who had already accepted their fate. "We make our stand here," Thorn said, his voice carrying over the ruins. "We hold the line. We give the civilians time to escape. We die with honor." The knights nodded, their expressions set in stone. They knew what was coming. They'd seen it in the endless battles, in the faces of their fallen brothers, in the piles of alien corpses that littered the ground like refuse. There was no victory here, only the inevitable end. But they would meet it head-on, with swords drawn and blood in their teeth. The ground shook as the first wave of aliens hit their defenses. The knights had fortified their position as best they could, barricades of rubble, makeshift trenches, and gun emplacements scavenged from the wreckage. But it was all temporary, all fragile. Against the sheer numbers of the enemy, it wouldn't hold for long. Thorn was the first to meet the charge, his sword a flash of steel as he cut down the nearest alien. It was a grotesque thing, all claws and teeth, its skin a mottled gray, its eyes black pits of hatred. Thorn's blade sheared through its torso, splitting it in half with a wet crunch. Blood sprayed across his visor, but he didn't stop, didn't even slow down. The aliens came at them in a swarm, a mass of churning bodies and snapping jaws. The knights met them with swords and shields, hacking and slashing in a frenzy of violence. The air was filled with the sounds of battle screams, the clang of metal on bone, the wet, sickening thud of flesh being torn apart. Thorn's world narrowed to the few feet in front of him, his focus on the next alien, the next kill. His sword arm ached, his muscles screamed in protest, but he kept swinging, kept cutting through the endless tide of enemies. The ground beneath him was slick with blood, his boots slipping on the gore-soaked earth. But he didn't falter. All around him, the knights fought with the same desperate fury. The battle was chaos, a swirling maelstrom of bodies and blood, where life and death were separated by a fraction of a second. There was no time to think, no time to feel, only the primal, animal instinct to survive, to kill. The aliens pressed hard, their numbers overwhelming, their attacks relentless. The barricades crumbled under the assault, the trenches filled with bodies, both human and alien. The knights were forced back, step by bloody step, as the enemy surged forward, their claws tearing through armor, their teeth sinking into flesh. Thorn's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurred by sweat and blood. He was tired, so damn tired, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close to the end. He saw a knight go down beside him, his throat ripped out by a snarling alien. Another was dragged into the swarm, his screams cut off by the crush of bodies. But there was no time to help, no time to mourn. Thorn fought on, his sword a blur of motion, cutting down anything that came near. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him. the exhaustion gnawing at his bones, but he pushed it aside, buried it deep. There was only the fight. There was only the kill. The alien horde surged forward, and the knights were pushed back to the last line of defense, a half-collapsed building that offered little protection, but was all they had left. Thorn could see the end coming, could feel it in the way the knights moved, slower, more sluggish, their strikes less precise, less deadly. But they didn't give up. They didn't surrender. They fought on, with everything they had, even as the enemy closed in around them. And then, in the midst of the carnage, Thorn saw it, the massive, hulking form of the alien commander, towering above the swarm, its body a grotesque mass of muscle and armor, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. It was the source, the heart of the invasion, the mind behind the endless waves of soldiers. Thorn knew what he had to do. With a roar, he charged forward, cutting a path through the alien ranks, his sword leaving a trail of carnage in its wake. The aliens tried to stop him, tried to drag him down, but he was beyond pain, beyond exhaustion. He was nothing but a blade, a force of nature, cutting through flesh and bone, his mind focused on one thing: the kill. He reached the commander, his body screaming in protest, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of red. The alien turned to face him, its maw opening in a roar that shook the ground. It swung a massive, clawed arm at him, but Thorn ducked under the blow, driving his sword deep into the creature's side. The alien howled in pain, its body convulsing as it tried to dislodge the blade. But Thorn held on, twisting the sword, driving it deeper, feeling the heat of the creature's blood spilling over him. The alien lashed out, its claws raking across his chest, tearing through armor and flesh, but Thorn didn't let go. With a final, desperate push, he drove the sword up into the creature's heart, feeling the blade bite into something vital. The alien shuddered, its eyes going wide with shock, and then it collapsed, its massive body crashing to the ground with a bone-rattling thud. Thorn stumbled back, his vision swimming, his strength leaving him. He could feel the blood pouring from his wounds, soaking into the earth beneath him. But he had done it. He had killed the commander. The battle was over. But there was no victory in it, no triumph. Only the cold, hard reality of war. Thorn fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his grasp. Around him, the knights fought on, but their numbers were too few, their strength too spent. The aliens, leaderless but still driven by their base instincts, continued to press forward, overwhelming the last of the human defenders. As the world darkened around him, Thorn saw the end coming. He saw the knights fall, one by one, until there was no one left. And then the aliens turned their attention to him, their eyes filled with hunger. Thorn closed his eyes, feeling the cold of death creeping in. But he didn't feel fear, didn't feel regret. He had done his duty. He had fought for Terra, for humanity. And that was enough. With a final breath, he whispered the oath one last time, his voice barely a whisper in the chaos. "For Terra," he said. "For humanity." And then the darkness took him.